Hey there, AP Environmental Science class. Okay, welcome back to my lecture on Chapter 3, Ecosystems. What are they and how do they work? This is Part 2. Now, we left off with Part 1, talking about basically food webs, food chains, talking about trophic levels and how as energy moves through these trophic levels in the ecosystem, that you actually lose 90% of the energy. That was that energy pyramid we talked about, and actually we'll talk a little bit more about that again as we go through this second part of the lecture again on Chapter 3. So some ecosystems produce plant matter faster than others do. So we need to talk about a couple of terms here. First is called the GPP. This is your gross primary productivity. And what is that? Well, it's the rate at which an ecosystem's producers, again, those autotrophs, convert solar energy to stored chemical energy. So it's basically the rate at which a plant or some kind of producer, again, would go through that photosynthesis, right? And convert that solar energy into stored energy, usually measured in units such as kilocalories per meter squared per year, something like that. Okay, so again, that's your gross primary productivity. But a better way to look at how ecosystems produce plant matter is with the net primary productivity, otherwise known as the NPP. This is kind of similar to those of you who may have a job already, and if you don't have a job, I'm sure you'll be getting one within the next couple of years. Obviously, you have your gross pay, right, which is the pay that comes out, all the pay you get, and then after all the taxes are taken out, you have your net pay, and that's actually what you get to take home and put in your pocket. So kind of similar to here, we have the gross primary productivity, which is again the rate at which those ecosystems producers convert solar energy to chemical energy. However, the net primary productivity, may be a better way to actually analyze this, because the net primary productivity takes the gross primary productivity, that rate at which an ecosystem's producers convert solar energy to chemical energy, minus the rate at which they use the stored energy for aerobic respiration. Okay, again, we talked about aerobic respiration in part 1 of this lecture. So the net primary productivity, again, you would take your gross and you're going to minus, okay, how much of that stored energy is actually used for aerobic respiration, and then that would be considered your net primary productivity, or your NPP. Terrestrial ecosystems and aquatic life zones differ in their NPP, and I'm going to show you a graph in just a second. The planet's net primary productivity ultimately limits the number of consumers, including humans, that can survive on the Earth. All right, so this is kind of the number that is going to limit that, because obviously you need enough of that chemical energy around to go through those trophic levels, right? And because we're losing 90% at every trophic level, if you don't have enough NPP to start with, then by the time you get to the tertiary consumers that we are, right, there won't be any kilocalories left, won't be any energy left. Okay, so again, the planet's NPP ultimately limits the number of consumers that can survive. All right, so we're going to take a look at this chart here. Again, this kind of shows that some ecosystems produce plant matter faster than others. This is probably a chart that I think you should at least have a general idea of what's going on here. All right, you'll notice on the x-axis, we have the average NPP, or your average net primary productivity. And then going up the y-axis, basically just types of terrestrial and aquatic ecosystems. So you'll notice swamps and marshes, and there are those tropical rainforests that I talked about at the beginning of part 1 of this chapter. They produce the most, or have the most, average NPP. You'll notice temperate forests kind of come next, et cetera, and you'll notice down at the extreme desert, you're not getting much NPP there. Makes a lot of sense, right? Because how much life do you get in the desert? Not many, right? Especially consumers, not many consumers in the desert. And this is really why, okay? There's no, the average net primary productivity is very low. Look at aquatic ecosystems, all right? Estuaries are the biggest one. We're going to talk about this when we get to conserving aquatic ecosystems, but the estuaries, which are the waterways right near land, right? Where kind of fresh water gets into salt water. Those are the most important parts of the aquatic ecosystem. You'll notice estuaries producing the most net primary productivity. You'll notice that the open ocean, right out there in the middle of the ocean, actually has the least NPP of all the aquatic ecosystems. Okay, so definitely have a general idea of this chart and just a general idea of what ecosystems produce the most NPP compared to what produced the last. You don't have to memorize the actual numbers here, all right, but just have a general idea of what's going on. All right, critical concept here, what happens to energy in a food chain? Now, we did already talk about this a little bit. You'll notice, though, as I go through these lectures, I'll sometimes talk about something in part one, and then I'll kind of talk about it again in part two. That's on purpose, okay, to kind of drive home important concepts. So, ecological efficiency is the percentage of energy transferred from one trophic level to the next in an ecosystem. So remember, we talked about that 10% rule. 90% is lost as you go from trophic level to trophic level. Only 10% is really what's available. That's why we took those numbers, 1,000 divided by or multiplied by 10%, and then the next one was 10, and then we multiplied again, and the next higher up was 1. Remember that pyramid from part 1? If you don't, go back and take a look at it. But again, that was the 10% rule. And what did I say in part 1? Most of that energy is lost as waste heat. Okay, now some of the energy contained in detritus and metabolic waste will provide energy for decomposers and those detritivores. Okay, but again, most of the energy here is lost as waste heat. So something to think about. Again, I told you it was important in part 1, that pyramid, that 10% rule. Definitely understand that rule. All right, so what happens to matter in an ecosystem? All right, we're going to talk about now some of these cycles. So nutrients cycle within and among ecosystems. Cycles are driven by incoming solar energy and gravity. And they also, though, can be altered by human activity, like the carbon cycle we'll talk about. Obviously, we're altering that, and that's why we're getting the global warming that we're seeing on planet Earth. So what are the 4 cycles that we're going to be most concerned about here in environmental science? Going to be the water cycle, the carbon cycle, the nitrogen cycle, and the phosphorus cycle. Okay, so I'm going to go through each one of these in detail. You're definitely going to have to know a good amount of what's going on in each of these cycles, especially for any FRQ questions that may pop up. All right, so again, I will go with them to you now. So hopefully the water cycle is going to be the easiest of all 3 of these. You've been dealing with the water cycle since you were at elementary school. All right, so the water cycle sustains all life, also called the hydrologic cycle. Okay, water cycle, hydrologic cycle, same thing. All right, collects, purifies, and distributes Earth's fixed supply of water. Okay, again, Earth, we're not getting any more water coming into Earth, all right? How do we think water first arrived here? By comets, okay? At the beginning of the early solar system, when comets were raining down on Earth all the time, the water, the ice, right? Comets are balls of ice. We believe that's how the water kind of got here. Obviously, we don't have comets raining down on Earth anymore. All right, so pretty much the water we have is basically finite. It's a fixed supply. Incoming solar energy causes evaporation, right? And then gravity draws water back as precipitation. Either surface runoff evaporates to complete the cycle, and some of that precipitation may be stored as groundwater. So here is a graph or a chart or a picture showing that the water cycle. I would definitely understand what's going on in this picture. All right, you have evaporation from the ocean. All right, obviously evaporation, condensation, right? You got transpiration, which is water being released from the leaves of plants. All right, precipitation. Then you're either going to have runoff back into the streams, into rivers and oceans, or maybe you're going to have some infiltration and percolation, which means that water goes down into the ground and ends up becoming groundwater in aquifers. Okay, so again, this is back to your earth science days. Hopefully you do remember this. So again, make sure you have a general understanding of the main parts of the water cycle. Ways humans have been altering the water cycle? Well, we're withdrawing large amounts of fresh water at rates faster than nature can replace it. So we did say water is a renewable resource, but it takes time. Okay, so as we draw water out of these aquifers, okay, which are basically reservoirs under the ground with water, as we pull the water out quicker than the water can infiltrate, or precipitation, right, can rain down and then the water infiltrates back down. If you're pulling out water from the aquifer faster than the water is infiltrating and going back into that aquifer, what's going to happen? Well, eventually the aquifer is going to be dry, and you're not going to have any water until it replenishes itself. And again, that could take 50 to 100 years or so. We're clearing vegetation, so that's actually increasing runoff and decreasing that infiltration. Again, back to your earth science days. So as we clear vegetation for cattle grazing or for people to live, right, homes, roads, things like that, instead of the water infiltrating the ground and going into these underground aquifers, that water is basically running off. We're also draining and filling wetlands for farming and urban development. Wetlands, believe it or not, provide flood control. If you have these wetlands between an ocean and where you may be living, right? If the ocean comes in and you have, let's say, a big storm, maybe a storm surge, the wetlands basically control the flood. Well, you get rid of those wetlands, what's going to happen? That water now just goes right into people's homes, okay? So that's an issue because these wetlands absorb and hold overflows of water. So you get rid of the wetlands, and obviously you get rid of what absorbs and holds overflows of water. And so where do those overflows go? Into people's homes, into people's properties, things like that. Okay, next cycle we'll talk about is the carbon cycle, and carbon cycles among living and non-living things. Carbon is in the basic building blocks of carbohydrates, fats, proteins, DNA, and other organic compounds. Photosynthesis from producers, right, removes carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, and then aerobic respiration in our cells from producers, consumers, and decomposers add carbon dioxide back into the atmosphere. In addition, some of that carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is actually sequestered or dissolved in the ocean, and it's actually stored in marine sediments. Okay, so this is some of what we talk about with the carbon cycle. So again, here's another chart for you or picture. Definitely have a general idea of what's going on here. Okay, we have carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Again, you have forest fires, deforestation, transportation, right? Cars and stuff releasing fossil fuels, which is carbon, into the air, okay? But then we have some diffusion of that carbon coming back down into the ocean, sequestered in the ocean. Some of that carbon is sequestered in plants, right? And then we have our decomposition, which actually releases carbon dioxide again back into the atmosphere, and some of the decomposers suck in some carbon dioxide, okay? So again, this is something that you should have a general idea of. Again, you may not have to memorize everything on this picture, but I definitely would have a general idea of parts of the carbon cycle so that if you have to answer it on an FRQ or something, you have enough information to look at. Now, obviously, us humans are disrupting the carbon cycle because what we're doing is adding large quantities of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere at a faster rate than the natural processes can remove or sequester that carbon. So again, the carbon cycle, and I'll go back to it, has been around forever, okay? But what hasn't been around forever? Transportation, right? So we're driving cars now and releasing more of that carbon into the air. Deforestation, that wasn't happening on a wide scale even a couple of hundred years ago, okay? So now with the deforestation, you have less trees. Burning it also releases it, but you have less trees. If you don't burn them, you have less trees to sequester or to bring in that carbon dioxide, right, through photosynthesis. And so obviously it stays in the atmosphere. And that obviously is what is producing the global warming. Levels have been increasing sharply since about the 1960s. And again, the result is a warming atmosphere and changing climate. Clearing vegetation also reduces the ability to remove excess carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. Now, we're going to do a whole unit on on climate change toward the end of the year. So we'll get into this a little more. But again, definitely have a general idea of the carbon cycle. All right, the next cycle we're going to talk about is the nitrogen cycle. And this is bacteria in action, those decomposers we were talking about. All right, so useful forms of nitrogen created by lightning and specialized bacteria in topsoil and bottom sediment of aquatic systems. That nitrogen then is used by plants to produce proteins, nucleic acids, and vitamins. Bacteria convert nitrogen compounds back into nitrogen gas, okay? That again can potentially be used. Now, humans are altering the nitrogen cycle. We're burning gasoline and other fossil fuels that create nitric oxide, which can return as acid rain. Okay, so again, too much nitrogen coming down in that acid rain. We're removing large amounts of nitrogen from the atmosphere to make fertilizers. So that's kind of the opposite thing, right? We're removing all this nitrogen, which is needed for the normal nitrogen cycle to continue. We're taking large amounts of it out to make fertilizers. We're also then adding excess nitrates into our aquatic system, because where do you think those fertilizers go when it rains? Right? You put fertilizer on your lawn, it rains. Where does that fertilizer go? It runs off into the rivers, which eventually goes into the lakes, which eventually goes into the oceans. There are your aquatic systems. So now we're adding more nitrogen to the aquatic systems than would normally be there, and that disrupts the cycle. Human nitrogen inputs to the environment have risen sharply and are expected to continue to rise. So once again, a chart for you. Once again, have a general idea of what's going on with this chart, okay? So you'll notice, just to kind of start, we have nitrogen in the atmosphere, okay? Denitrification from bacteria, all right, actually releases nitrogen gas into the atmosphere. Nitrogen fixation by bacteria takes nitrogen out of the atmosphere. So again, bacteria are doing both. They're taking nitrogen out by fixating it, and then by denitrification, they are releasing that nitrogen back out into the atmosphere. Okay, nitrogen in animals, consumers. Again, where do they go? The decomposers will use that. That will go back into the soil, and then there's your nitrification by bacteria, again, which then creates ammonia to nitrates, which then the bacteria can use, or plants can use, right? Uptake by plants, okay, to use as nutrients for them, okay? Here we have some nitrogen going into the ocean sediments, all right, lost to deep ocean sediments. That nitrogen we can't use, but some of this nitrogen in the ocean sediments, messing up the cycle there. All right, so here are your nitrates from fertilizer runoff and decomposition, right, going into the water system, the aquatic ecosystems, and then again going into the soil, okay? So please have a general idea of this and understand what's going on in this nitrogen cycle. I have seen questions asked on FRQs, on tests about AP Environmental Science tests about the nitrogen cycle. So definitely have a better understanding of it. And if you do have some questions, definitely come and see me. Okay, the last cycle we'll talk about is the phosphorus cycle. Phosphorus cycles through water, rock, and food webs. Now, the phosphorus cycle is a very, very slow one. Okay, phosphorus cycles through water, the Earth's crust, and living organisms. Major reservoir for phosphorus is phosphate rocks. And again, this is a very slow cycle, but human activities and impacts, clearing forests affects this cycle, removing large amounts of phosphates from the earth to make fertilizers. Again, here we go. And then erosion leaches phosphates into streams, right? So we take phosphates out of the atmosphere. We make these fertilizers. We throw fertilizers on the ground, and then the fertilizer, right, erodes away, leaches, which is basically coming down into the stream. So now you get the phosphates in streams, and now you have a higher level of phosphorus in our aquatic ecosystems than we would normally have. So once again, a way humans are disrupting the phosphorus cycle. All right. So once again, you have a picture here. Once again, I would have a general idea of what's going on here. All right, so again, you'll notice phosphate dissolved in water. Some plant producers will use that phosphate along with bacteria and animal consumers. Some of that phosphate in shallow ocean sediments, right, go into the ocean food webs. All right, plate tectonics can lead to some issues with the phosphate, because now we have the rock cycle, right? As the phosphorus goes through rocks and bones and things like that. Then erosion will bring some of that phosphate back into the water, et cetera, et cetera. All right. So again, definitely have a general idea of what's going on with the phosphorus cycle, and definitely come see me if you have any questions. All right, just 2 more slides left, kind of basic here. How do scientists study ecosystems? Well, some methods of study: field research, going into forests and natural settings and actually looking at what's going on. Obviously, we could bring stuff back into the lab and do simulations with laboratory research. And then mathematical and other computer models can be used as well to kind of see what happens. Again, we can use a model to see what happens, with climate change 200 years from now, 2,000 years from now, if our carbon continues to increase, things like that. Other study tools used: aircraft, satellites, GIS software, GPS systems to track track where animals go, etc. Ecologists do laboratory research and do use models. Again, model ecosystems and populations under laboratory conditions, simplified systems with controlled temperature, light, humidity, and other variables. And then they would support that laboratory research with actual going out into the field and seeing if what they saw in the laboratory is actually occurring out in real life in the field. And again, talking about those mathematical models that can simulate ecosystems is a way to study large and complex systems. All right, guys, so that is chapter 3, ecosystems. What are they and how do they work? And as always, thanks for listening.